You wake up, not in your own bed, but in a chamber that feels more like a coffin dressed in silk. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of wax and dust, as if the walls themselves have been holding their breath for centuries. You are 16, yet the silence around you weighs like the centuries of a dynasty pressing on your chest. The bed you rise from is gilded, the sheets fine, but none of it feels yours. It is not a sanctuary. It is a stage, and you, barely more than a child, are its sacrifice. They have crowned you not with roses, but with thorns sharpened into gold. Power is supposed to be dazzling, but to you it reeks of suffocation. You see the irony. Your hands, still trembling with youth, are forced to hold the scepter of kings. Your eyes that longed for books and prayer are forced to stare down the abyss of ambition. You are no queen by desire. You are a pawn, dressed as a sovereign, moved across a board carved by men who whisper promises with daggers in their breath. What is a crown, if not a chain, polished to blind the innocent? What is fate if it binds a girl to a throne that was never hers to claim? Perhaps the cruelest question lingers in the silence of your chamber. Is destiny written in the accident of blood, or in the choices of those who exploit it? You are not only Jane. You are the echo of a family that clawed its way into the marrow of England's crown. The gray name is older than your pulse, older than the very prayers whispered over your childhood bed. In the dim corridors of Bradgate House, portraits of the Suffolk line stare down with painted eyes that never close. Each brushstroke is a command. Continue us. Elevate us. Do not let us vanish. Your mother, Lady Frances Brandon, carried the blood of Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor. That blood, hot, restless, royal, flowed into you before you ever understood its cost. Your father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, dreamed of more than dukedoms. He dreamed of crowns, of titles that would scrape the heavens. But ambition has a stench, and in the shadows of those gilded halls, you could smell it, a mix of burning wax and old iron. The scent of a destiny forged not in innocence, but in hunger. The Suffolks were a family of fractures, unity carved thin by greed. Every corridor of their history whispers betrayal. Every banquet table carried the weight of unspoken threats. For Jane, this legacy was not an inheritance, but a suffocating cradle. The family name wrapped around her like a shroud, its weight pressing her toward the throne whether she wished it or not. The House of Grey had painted its walls with ambition. And within those painted walls you feel the cage tighten. The crown that suffocated you in the chamber was not born. Yesterday, it was hammered into place by ancestors who refused to let their blood sink quietly into history's dust. London in 1553 was a city breathing sickness. Its king, Edward VI, was no more than a shadow stretched thin across the throne. Pale, coughing, his body already surrendering to decay, Edward carried within his weakening chest the fate of a realm. The court around him knew it. The corridors of Whitehall became places of whispers, words dripping like venom in candlelit corners. Every flicker of flame seemed to conceal a plot. Every silence carried the weight of a dying boy king's breath. And in that silence, your name, Jane Grey, was whispered not as daughter, not as scholar, but as a weapon. Your intelligence, once praised for its devotion to scripture and learning, became twisted into proof of your worthiness to rule. They said your piety would sanctify a kingdom trembling with religious fracture. They said your purity would heal the cracks left by Henry VIII's chaos. But purity in politics is a mask, one worn just long enough to disguise the dagger beneath. You were never asked. You were told. Told that obedience was God's will, that silence was virtue, that destiny was an inheritance you could neither question nor escape. In the glow of flickering candles, your innocence was not protected. It was auctioned, gambled, consumed. The frailty of a boy on the throne became the excuse for a girl to be placed upon it. And in that exchange, morality itself was broken. The court was not saving England. It was feeding it another sacrifice. And somewhere, in the heavy stillness of that summer, the first notes of betrayal began to hum, a sound you could not yet hear, but one that would soon drown every prayer you had ever spoken. Edward's cough was more than illness. It was the tolling of a bell no one wished to hear. As his strength withered, so too did the certainty of England's future. In the quiet of his chambers, parchment was unrolled, ink prepared, words sharpened into weapons. It was called a devise for the succession. Not a law passed through Parliament, not the sacred stamp of unbroken tradition, but the desperate handwriting of a dying boy king. In this fragile script, Edward sought to erase his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both branded with the stain of illegitimacy in the eyes of law and faith. He feared Mary's Catholicism, Elizabeth's uncertain loyalty, and so he reached instead toward you, Jane Grey, innocent, devout, Protestant, pliable. The crown, once bound by bloodline and precedent, became instead a parchment reshaped by fear and by men who whispered at the king's bedside. The legitimacy of this devise was contested even then. Lawyers muttered about its weakness. Counselors weighed the risks in sleepless nights. But parchment, once written, becomes prophecy in the hands of the powerful. And so the ink dried, carrying your name as if fate itself had been rewritten. You can almost hear it now. Your own footsteps echoing through the marble halls of Whitehall, each step heavier than the last. You are being carried forward not by will, but by a chain invisible, forged in ink and ambition. Was Edward's act the will of a boy desperate to preserve his faith, or the manipulation of men who saw in him only a fragile vessel for their schemes? The parchment does not answer. The crown never explains, and the question lingers, cold and merciless. Is power ever innocent, or is it always written in the blood of those who cannot refuse it? The court did not breathe, it hissed. In the corridors of power, whispers slithered like serpents, their tongues flickering with schemes too dangerous to speak aloud in daylight. At the heart of this nest of venom stood John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. He was no mere courtier. He was the puppeteer, tugging invisible strings, weaving destiny with the patience of a spider. To him, your crown was not salvation. It was opportunity. He had married his son, Guildford Dudley, into your family, binding you not with love but with chains disguised as vows. Every embrace was a calculation, every smile a blade hidden beneath velvet. He moved men like pieces on a board, silk sleeves hiding the daggers clenched within their fists. You were his queen not because of your holiness, but because you were young enough, devout enough, malleable enough to be sculpted into his tool. In the candlelit chambers, the weight of it pressed in. You could feel the invisible hand at your back, guiding you forward, pushing you toward a throne that glimmered with gold but dripped with poison. The courtiers bowed, but their eyes betrayed hunger. They were not loyal to you. They were loyal to the game itself. Loyal only until the tides shifted. To stand in that court was to be both ornament and hostage, body wrapped in silks that disguised the chains beneath. And the cruelest part was knowing every word spoken in soft tones, every bow made in reverence, was only the rehearsal of a betrayal already waiting in the wings. They placed the crown upon your head, but it felt less like a coronation and more like a burial. July 10th, 1553, your name was proclaimed across London. Jane, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland. The trumpets blared, but their notes rang hollow, bouncing off stone walls that seemed to know your reign would not outlast the echo. In the sterile grandeur of the throne room, every jewel glittered like ice, cold and unforgiving. The weight of the crown pressed against your brow not as an honor, but as a shackle. You looked into the sea of faces, their cheers rehearsed, their loyalty brittle. The people whispered prayers with lips that trembled. They had seen monarchs rise and fall before, and fear curdled beneath their shouts of, "Long live the Queen!" For 9 days, England's machinery turned in your name. Decrees were issued, coins were struck, letters sealed with your royal signet. Yet every act of sovereignty only deepened the silence of unease. Your counselors paced like men standing on a ship that had already begun to sink, their eyes darting toward Mary Tudor, gathering her supporters in the countryside, her shadow lengthening by the hour. Shadow lengthening by the hour. You were only 16. Your hands, ink-stained from study, now signed away kingdoms. Your faith was fierce, your mind sharp, but hope was no match for the storm that gathered. History itself seemed to hold its breath as your reign, so sudden in its birth, sped toward its inevitable collapse. 9 days. That was all it took. A crown gained in haste, a throne drenched in dread, and a girl queen remembered not for what she ruled, but for how swiftly it was torn from her grasp. The sound comes first, distant, rhythmic, unstoppable. Hooves striking the earth, boots trampling gravel roads, banners unfurling in the wind. You listen and you know, those are not just footsteps. They are history itself, marching toward you with Mary Tudor at its head. Word spreads like wildfire. In the countryside, Mary gathers thousands. Nobles, soldiers, peasants, hearts stirred not by policy but by blood. They chant her name as if it were a prayer, and every voice that joins swells the tide against you. London grows restless. The cheers that once met your proclamations thin to murmurs, then to silence. Fear spreads in the courtyards. Even the guards glance toward the gates as if expecting them to burst open at any moment. You are 16, and already you feel the knife of inevitability press against your throat. The counselors who once swore loyalty now whisper behind closed doors, weighing their own survival against yours. Their ambition begins to rot, peeling away into cowardice. You see it in their eyes. The same hands that lifted you up are preparing to let you fall. And yet, what choice did you ever have? You were born into a web of obedience, a cage spun of ancestry and ambition. To refuse the crown was treason. To accept it was death. Now, as Mary's forces tighten their grip, you stand in the heart of London, listening to the pulse of destiny quicken. Obedience or survival, neither belongs to you. The Empire's game is nearly finished, and you are the piece already marked for sacrifice. Your father's hands were meant to cradle you, to shield you from the world's cruelties. Instead, they trembled with ambition, reaching not for your safety, but for a throne that was never his to take. Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, your father, your guardian, and the man who unknowingly signed your death warrant. He believed himself a player in destiny's game, but he was only ever a pawn. His alliances shifted like sand, first with Northumberland, then away, then desperately back again. His miscalculations were not whispers in the shadows, but blunders carved into the walls of history. Each scheme he chased tightened the noose around your neck. What is more tragic? A father too blind to see the trap, or too proud to admit he had led his daughter into it? His ambition was poison, dripped slowly until it coursed through your veins. Until even your piety, your brilliance became tools for his desperate grasp at power. And when the tide turned, when Mary's banners rose and the people abandoned your cause, his courage collapsed. The Duke of Suffolk, who once dared to gamble England's crown, could not protect the child who bore its crushing weight. His hands, stained with political blood, were empty when you needed them most. This was not just betrayal of politics, it was betrayal of blood. A father's duty exchanged for the glitter of a crown, a daughter's life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. And so you were left, abandoned even by the man whose love should have been your last refuge, bound by chains of family as much as by the state. The courtroom was not built for justice. It was built for spectacle. You, 16 and slight, were placed at its center like prey displayed before a hungry crowd. The November air hung damp and heavy, but inside the Guildhall it was stifling. Too many bodies pressed together, too many eyes fixed upon you. Justice here was not blind. It stared with cold calculation. The charges rang out. Treason, usurpation, the theft of a crown that you had never sought. The prosecutor's voice cut like a blade. Jane Dudley, commonly called Jane Grey, traitor to the realm. You spoke softly but firmly, denying intent. I am guiltless of having broken the law. I did not seek the crown. It was forced upon me. Yet your words, steeped in truth, fell into a silence deaf to innocence. The trial was a grotesque theater. Every bough of parchment, every quill-scratching judgment was already scripted. The outcome had been sealed long before you stepped across the stone floor. Law had been drained of morality, reduced to a weapon wielded by power. Your youth, your faith, your unwillingness, none of it mattered. To the court, you were not a girl. You were a symbol, an obstacle, a lesson to be burned into England's memory. And so the verdict came, heavy as iron, guilty. Death by execution. In that moment, you ceased to be a queen, ceased even to be a defendant. You became something else, a martyr of ambition, of law twisted into cruelty, of a world where innocence was never enough to stand against the hunger for power. The days between sentence and death stretched like a noose tightening around your throat. Each dawn broke colder, each prayer heavier. London whispered of your fate. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. You are led from the tower toward the scaffold, steps echoing against ancient stone. The air is sharp, the February wind biting at your thin frame. Around you, the crowd gathers, faces blurred, not from distance, but from the veil of tears and fear clouding your sight. Every heartbeat they carry thunders like drums, each one a cruel reminder that they are here not to save you, but to witness history consume you. The scaffold rises black against the pale sky, wood rough with the memory of others who stood where you now walk. The axe glimmers, indifferent, its edge hungering not for justice, but for flesh. In second-person reflection, you know you have been too good, too obedient, too trusting in a world carved by corruption. And yet it is precisely that goodness that condemns you, your innocence weaponized, your faith exploited. A question haunts the moment. In a land where ambition is survival, is purity itself a crime? As you kneel, blindfolded, the straw-strewn boards creak beneath you. Time fractures! The world narrows to breath, to prayer, to silence. And then inevitability. Your story, your life, is swallowed by the blade. But the echo of your death stains England forever. The blade has not yet fallen. And yet the world already feels dimmed, muffled by the hush of dread. You stand, or rather you kneel before eternity, and in that instant history leans closer, straining to catch your last breath. Eyewitnesses would later whisper of your composure, of a girl of 16 speaking with the wisdom of saints. John Fox preserved the words, "I here die a true Christian woman." Your voice carried not defiance, but clarity, each syllable brighter than the cold February light. You prayed not for vengeance, but for mercy, not for thrones, but for truth. And the crowd, their jeers strangled in their throats, felt for a moment as though heaven itself had leaned down to listen. There is a grotesque beauty in your piety, the rope of fear snapping under the weight of faith, the soft rhythm of prayer softening the brutality of the axe. Innocence, once mocked as weakness, becomes the one thing uncorrupted, the one force that the blade cannot sever. And yet, a question burns beneath the reverence. What is courage to the powerless? Does it sanctify, lifting you into legend, or does it merely gild the chains of suffering, making oppression more palatable to those who watch? Your death becomes both mirror and warning, holy to some, but to others, proof that purity is powerless against ambition's teeth. The axe descends. The silence after is louder than any sermon. Your courage lingers, not as triumph, but as wound. The axe that claimed your life did not end with you. Its echo traveled back through the Suffolk halls, splitting beams, rattling portraits, shaking loose the fragile foundations of a family that had gambled everything on ambition. Henry Grey, your father, once so certain of destiny, now wandered like a ghost through corridors emptied of hope. His miscalculations had not only cost him his daughter, but unraveled the very line he sought to exalt. The dukedom of Suffolk, once spoken with reverence in court, became a name muttered with caution, then silence, then forgetfulness. The estates themselves seemed to mourn. Abandoned chambers gathered dust, their hearths cold, their walls whispering betrayal. Portraits of ancestors. Frances Brandon with her Tudor blood, the proud Greys with their defiant gazes, stared down from cracked canvas, their eyes dimmed by history's contempt. Once symbols of power, they now hung as warnings, silent witnesses to a legacy devoured by its own hunger. Visceral imagery clings, banquet tables rotting under cobwebs, armor rusting in corners where no heir remained to wear it, gardens grown wild, as though nature itself had reclaimed what arrogance had stolen. And in that ruin lies reflection. History does not forgive those who gamble against its tide. Defiance without strength becomes folly, and folly becomes erasure. The Suffolk name, once paraded with grandeur, became an empty shell, a cautionary echo. Your death was the crown of tragedy, but the fall of your line was the grave. Together they remind us that history does not only kill the body, it erases the name. History loves to polish its crowns, but in the dust beneath them lie bones and bloodlines forgotten. For every Mary, Elizabeth, and Henry etched into memory, there are others, claimants who flickered like candle flames before being snuffed out. Lady Margaret Clifford, Jane's cousin, once carried Tudor blood with enough weight to threaten suspicion, yet her story survives only in footnotes. Others, distant branches of Plantagenet descent, lived beneath the shadow of the axe, their names trembling at every change of monarch, their lives balancing between exile and execution. The corridors of power were haunted not just by kings and queens, but by those who might have been. Their whispers echo in records half-burnt, in genealogies scribbled with trembling ink. You can almost hear them. Children promised crowns they would never wear. Mothers who dreamed thrones into their cradles. Men who signed their death warrants the moment they were born. But history, like a cruel judge, remembers selectively. It keeps the victors gilded in portraits while the lesser heirs dissolve into silence. Their faces blur, their voices fade, until only the ghosts remain, trapped not in castles, but in absence, in the spaces where their names should have been. And so a question festers. Is memory truth, or simply obedience to power? What of the forgotten bloodlines? Do they cease to exist, or do they live on in us unrecognized but pulsing still? History builds its monuments on silence, but the silence is never empty. It is full of the voices it chose not to keep. Power is a paradox sharpened to a blade. It promises security, yet it devours those too innocent to wield it. Jane's story is proof. Her virtue made her desirable, her obedience made her useful, but these same qualities carved the path to her destruction. Innocence became the bait, not the shield. Crowns are not ornaments. They are knives pressed against the skull. Thrones are not seats. They are graves disguised in velvet. What is celebrated as ambition in men becomes fatal in the powerless, and what is praised as purity becomes a sentence when placed in the wrong hands. You feel it still, don't you? Across centuries, the clash between ambition and morality persists. How often do we dress corruption in silks and crucify honesty as weakness? Jane's brief reign is not ancient tragedy alone, it is a mirror. A reflection of every age where innocence is devoured, and power poisons even those who reach for it in desperation. The paradox remains unsolved, because perhaps it was never meant to be solved. It was meant to warn. You walk the corridors where Jane once walked. The air is heavy, though the centuries have passed. Each stone whispers her fear, her hope, her defiance. You imagine her voice, trembling yet steady, speaking prayers not for power but for deliverance. And in that echo you feel something disturbingly familiar, because her story is not locked in the 16th century. It is stitched into the fabric of every age. How many times have the innocent been used as shields for the ambitions of others? How many thrones, corporate, political, even personal, still demand sacrifices dressed in obedience? You are not separate from Jane. Her bloodline may have faded, but her warning survives. You feel it when you face manipulation masked as love, when you watch ambition hollow out trust, when you sense that power will always demand more than it gives. Walk slowly and listen closely. Her footsteps are still there. They are your own. The throne sits empty now, its velvet faded, its gold dulled by centuries of dust. Yet the silence it holds is louder than any coronation. You can almost hear the screams swallowed by those halls, the prayers whispered by trembling lips, the ambitions that turn to ash. History pretends to move on, but it never does. The cruelty remains, an inheritance passed like a curse. Jane's fall was not an accident. It was the system working exactly as it was designed. Power devours, and when it has finished, it demands more. What lesson remains? Perhaps that ambition without conscience is a plague. That innocence without protection is a sentence. That every crown is heavy with the bones buried to secure it. And yet, within the silence there is also a warning. A reminder that history does not forgive cruelty even if it forgets names. The echoes linger, waiting for us to listen. The gray line fades like ink washed by relentless rain. What once glittered with ambition now lies buried in silence, forgotten by all but history's restless ghosts. The Suffolk legacy, castles, titles, promises, crumbled into dust. Yet one whisper endures, the brief, haunting breath of Lady Jane Grey. You see her not in portraits or in dusty chronicles, but in the shadows between lines. A girl of 16 pulled like a marionette on strings woven from greed and fear. Her blood was spilled, her crown dissolved. But her defiance lingers. Every step to the scaffold was not just her own, it was the slow march of innocence crushed beneath the weight of power's endless hunger. Bloodlines die, but their lessons survive. Jane's whisper asks us still, what is power worth if it devours the very souls it touches? What does victory mean if it is written in the tears of children? The gray line is gone, its throne never secured, its name carved only faintly in England's stone. And yet, listen closely, the whisper is not silence. It is warning, it is memory, it is the last breath of a girl who should have been forgotten, but instead became eternal. It became eternal.